Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing? Hi. My name is Zoe Renee Lapon. I am a community organizer as well as a local DJ and photographer. We are here this morning to talk about empathy. To me, empathy is the most critical and important force of human nature and human interaction. Sister Angela Davis spoke wonderfully upon empathy yesterday. It is something that we carry with us in our work and in our everyday life. Empathy, if anything, is a catalyst. I studied college chemistry, so I'm going to unfortunately apply a lot of things I learned through chemistry and through to my brief little talk before we lead into our experts here. But a catalyst is defined as a force that implements a chemical reaction without actually being effective itself. To me, that is what empathy is. Empathy is the ability to create change and impactful change in a meaningful way without subtracting from the original equation. Empathy is one of those things, when acted right within the work, no one really notices at all, kind of like a catalyst. All right, so we have a beautiful session ahead of us today. We are welcoming Jacqueline Aco. Unfortunately, Joy, our Bostic, is not in today, so if we can, please send some healing vibes out for her and her family. Timothy Black and Damian Calvert. Jacqueline Aco is president of the Aco Group. It is a consulting firm which helps leaders achieve innovation with soul. She has helped clients with strategy, innovation, leadership, and empathy more than 20 years, including as a partner at McKinsey & Company. Jackie's 2014 TEDx talk sums it all up. She has a PhD in chemistry from MIT and a BS in chemistry from the University of Michigan. And as a fellow chemistry student, I am very excited to hear your talk, and as much as I'm looking forward to our other panelists' talks as well. Don't want to show any bias. So with further ado, I'm going to open the stage to Jacqueline, and we will begin.
Thank you, Zoe. I love your catalyst metaphor. I'm going to have to start using that one. Good morning, everybody. Before I actually start my prepared comments, I have to say, on this morning after the brutal attacks in Paris, there's actually no place I'd rather be than trying to sort out these issues that come from our global empathy deficit disorder than here with you today. So thank you so much, Rhonda and Case Western, Bud, Marilyn, for having us all here and having the right conversation, which, as those of us who were here with Sister Angela heard last night, we are talking about the right things. We're all connected across time and space and to each other, and Paris is just the latest example in a long string of violence. So may peace and healing be possible there and everywhere. Okay, so Zoe, thank you again for that gracious introduction. So if I were you, I might be thinking, MIT, McKinsey, what on earth can she know about empathy? That would be a good question. Let me start by telling you that I didn't learn it through my early education or work experience. Oh no, I learned it from the toughest, most demanding clients I've ever had. It was brutal and abrupt. I learned about empathy from these guys. They are my kids. They're 12 and 13 now, but back then, they put me through empathy boot camp. That doesn't mean that you must have kids to have empathy, or that everyone with kids does have empathy. I wish. Like most people, though, my education and work had gotten me deeper and deeper into my head and out of my heart, out of my capacity for empathy. But parenting is an opportunity to remember, and it's a two-way street. Cambridge University neuroscience professor Simon Baron-Cohen summarized seminal research in his book, The Science of Evil, on empathy and the origins of cruelty. It's not a light read, but it's well worth it. Toward the end, he talks about the power of parents to, quote, open the bank of empathy for their children, giving them an internal pot of gold. And it's a two-way street. Developmental scientists are now finding that parenting increases empathy in the brain for women and men. I suppose it's good that people are proving this, even though our grandmothers didn't need that study. They could tell you that no amount of empathy training at work could match caring for people in real life. So is this a parenting talk or an empathy and business talk? Stay with me. I promise to connect the dots. Since I'm the first speaker, let's define empathy. Zoe, I think with her catalyst metaphor, gave us a good start. Here's what you generally get. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Does empathy mean you have to have a bleeding heart? Absolutely not. And there's a lot of confusion out there giving empathy a bad name. As Dr. Rhonda said last night, it's mamsy-pamsy. But empathy is not sympathy, and it's not being nice. Being an empathic leader does not mean you have to bring soup to everyone's sick uncle. That definition is fine, but let me offer something a little deeper. Does anyone in here practice yoga? Okay, so then you know that yoga always ends with Namaste, which means the light inside of me sees the light inside of you. As I've come to practice empathy at home and at work, it really helps to think not just of suffering together or even celebrating together, but seeing the light inside. Babies, yoga. You may be wondering, when will we get down to business? Right now. Please consider this question for a moment. Do you work in an empathic, supportive, generative environment? It doesn't matter whether you work in a for-profit or a not-for-profit environment. If your answer is no, you're in excellent company, unfortunately. The most recent Gallup poll showed that a whopping 70%, that's 70 million people, say they are not engaged at work, not engaged in most of their waking hours. They show up physically, but their heart and soul are someplace else. After 2 decades of working in a huge variety of organizations, I can tell you that walking into most workplaces actually makes me hurt. This is not the only symptom of our empathy deficit disorder. My specialty has always been growth and innovation, helping clients make plans for a bold future. It's never easy, but some of them live into the future bravely and beautifully, like Social Justice Institute founder and director, Professor Rhonda Williams. But most organizations that try to do something new and special, to innovate, most of them fail. How do we know? Only 1% of companies drives 40% of new jobs, and only 1 in 10 sustains growth. And let's admit it, not all innovation is even good, is it? Let me tell you what I don't mean. Great innovation is not formulating the next snack chip with sugar and MSG that's making us sick and addicted, no matter how much revenues grow or how rich shareholders get. No. What I mean is innovation with soul, such as creating products that put the power of health in consumers' hands, or designing new ways to access vital things like education. Innovation with soul doesn't trade tomorrow's earth or our grandchildren's health for convenience and pleasure today. Innovation with soul leads to a more abundant world for everyone. Innovation with soul is very much related to social justice. Why don't we have more innovation with soul? What became crystal clear in our work with clients is that we do not innovate because we are afraid. We are afraid of change. It's only human, but there is no innovation without change. We are afraid of listening to others who are not like us, but different people, experiences, and ideas are exactly the ingredients we need for the best kind of innovation. After parental boot camp, I came to see clearly that empathy is what helps us be brave enough to co-create and move through change together. Can you imagine how a flow or a currency of empathy supports innovation and inclusion? Innovation requires change, which is hard for people even when it's good. Change brings fear, loss, frustration, even a rewiring of our brains. Empathy gives us the courage to move through all of that change together. Empathy is required for inclusion, too. Moving from fear to including people who are different from us starts with seeing each other more clearly. It starts with empathy. Without feeling understood and valued, employees will opt out emotionally, if not physically, which is exactly what's happening today. Innovation supports inclusion by growing the pie, and inclusion brings diverse views, creativity, and everyone all in. In short, inclusion brings real soul to empathy, to innovation. Okay. So all we need to do is decide to be empathic and organizations will flourish. Easy, right? No, because we're stuck in so many bad habits. It starts with how we talk. The language of business too often ignores human nature, or worse yet, exploits it. We talk about top grading rather than individual growth, offer external carrots and sticks rather than fire up the pilot light of intrinsic motivations. And here's a good one I learned at Mini MBA. Cash is king. Money is powerful, all right, but still not as fundamental as our conscience. Be it healthy, harsh, or absent, it is our conscience which dictates our behavior. It's not just about language, of course. The problem is we do walk the talk. It's baked into the systems, setting us up to compete rather than co-create, and judge rather than help each other grow. We devalue each other's time in meetings that go nowhere and under mountains of email, all the while rushing to meet short-term quarterly expectations. We insist on having one guy at the top on the hook, despite the enormous potential of shared leadership. The language can be rewritten and the systems redesigned, which is part of the work my colleagues and I do. But here's the thing I want you to remember. Empathy is a contact sport. Caring for others is the way we build our empathy. It's where it begins. But it's hard for working people to care with their hearts or their hands. For themselves, much less for anyone else. There just isn't time, in the US especially, where work-life balance is among the worst in the developed world. Despite technological advances that could help us work smarter and more flexibly, time famine is the most palpable at the high and low ends of the socioeconomic spectrum. People in poverty can't take a day off, much less a decent maternity or paternity leave. And women and men on the fast track are urged to lean into their career just as kids might come along. And there is an empathy-sapping social injustice in that. Let me explain. Leaning in is really leaning on. Whether you're working your way out of poverty or into the corner office, the current time crunch forces workers to outsource caring of children, aging parents, family, friends, and community, and even themselves. Rather than give people time to care and build their empathy muscles, we keep them overtime and then now provide simulated empathy training to appease our conscience. How crazy is this? Too many people who survive their climb to the top today pay a hidden price in their ability to empathize. The career ladder is designed as if we still die at 60 and retire at 55, forcing a false dichotomy of career and caregiving. The making of leaders, and by leaders, I mean people who merit our attention, should be a marathon, not a sprint to the corner office. We need to hear from more people who care about something and someone beyond themselves, and fewer Donald Trumps. When people commit evil acts, we always ask, why? Why did he do it? The absence of empathy is the best explanation I've ever heard. And Zoe, you'll appreciate that. It's like there is no cold. There is only the absence of heat. There is no dark. There is only the absence of light. Brain imaging shows zero negative empathy as a common trait in borderlines, narcissists, and psychopaths. So, if organizations sap our empathy, who rises and what happens? Bernie Madoff and Chainsaw Al Dunlop from Sunbeam, for those of you who remember him, they weren't the first, last, or only corporate psychopaths. GM, Volkswagen, and Pepsi aren't the first, last, or only organizations making decisions as if lives don't matter. Not now, and certainly not in the next generation. We cannot expect social justice if those in charge of so much money, people, and power, and the systems they steward, have so little empathy or healthy conscience. Let me leave you with some questions about empathy in business and the social justice impact. How can we expect a living wage for everyone when CEOs and boards think it's okay that one person's time is worth 580 times a frontline employee, as is true today at McDonald's? No matter how you slice it, it's all about hamburgers. When at the end of his tenure at Oracle, CEO Larry Ellison earned $18,500 an hour. $18,500 an hour, while his board and the analysts applauded. What on earth was he doing in that hour? How can we expect a truly flourishing and sustainable economy when so much of our GDP growth in this country is fueled by the devaluation of human lives, whether it's the hands that make and sell the high-volume, low-cost goods we voraciously consume, or the victims of one of our fastest-growing industries, the prison industrial complex? How can we expect affordable health care for everyone when the marketing director at a billion-dollar food company wakes up in the morning asking herself, how can I make these unhealthy and addictive foods more attractive to children so that our profits grow? And scientifically trained researchers take money from Coca-Cola to prove that soda is unrelated to childhood obesity. When well-meaning doctors are stuck in a system which earns its keep from our disease. When pharmaceutical company incentives shoot squarely at all of our fears of illness, aging, and even death, ignoring the fact that the right food is often better medicine than pills. You just can't patent that. How can we ensure future generations inherit a better world when we are forced to walk away from our conscience time and again? When car companies cut costs, jeopardizing the lives of people who buy their cars today, are we really surprised that their lobbyists and candidates block environmental legislation protecting the well-being of future generations? When a company penalizes a hardworking parent for needing to stay home to take care of a sick child, do we really think they give a damn about the grown-up people who work there? Much less the children who live in poverty all around us. 54% in Cleveland, right here, right now. Thank you. My last question about business and empathy and social justice is simply this: how are we going to bust out of this narcissistic moment we are in? What will it take? It's not just nice or even the right thing to do. It's good for innovation, inclusion, and employee engagement. In short, it's good for business. I have lots more ideas, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists, and I look forward to hearing from you. Meanwhile, I do want to thank the people who co-create with me, especially Rhonda Williams, for including us in this groundbreaking program, and you. We would love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aiko. Before we go into our next speaker, which will be Timothy Black, I just wanted to note that Jacqueline Aiko, you touched on so many tremendous points in your talk. You know, we are long into a critical point of the clashing of intersections between ideology and identity. Unfortunately, it has created like a palpable oppressive energy that has only been responded to with violence because there has been such a lack of response with empathy. The events in France, as unfortunate as they are, I think we are looking at the situation more sympathetically than we are emphatically. I think sympathy is very important, but empathy allows us to view it from the impact of the influence and the history from all sides in the event. And I think it's important that when we're looking at events like what happened in France, that we understand the entire context, not just the immediate topical context of what happened in the event, but the history behind everyone that's involved, what brought them there to that moment, and where those moments clashed together that was only that only resonated in unfortunate violence. And unfortunately, until we can look at these things, us as humans are going to continue to destroy each other in beyond tremendously unfortunate ways. So we'll keep that in mind. All right, our next presenter is Timothy Black. Timothy Black is the Associate Professor of Sociology and Faculty Affiliate of the Social Justice Institute at Case Western Reserve University. He is the author of When a Heart Turns Rock Solid, The Lives of Three Puerto Rican Brothers on and Off the Streets. Thank you. The book was named the best book of 2009 by the Washington Post and won the 2011 Mira Komarovsky, I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce that, Komarovsky, sorry. The Mira Komarovsky Book Award given by the Eastern Sociological Society. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Timothy Black to share his experiences and his perspectives.
Thank you, Zoe. It's an honor to be here, to be part of this conversation, to be part of the Social Justice Institute. I'm looking forward to the day and to your comments. My role here is to talk about empathy as a form of doing research. And then Damien, my research partner, is going to talk about some of the ways in which we're applying this in a current research study that we're doing. Empathy is, for me, a way of knowing. It's a way of knowing those who we cross boundaries to know. It's a way of knowing those who live in the same social spaces that we live in. It's a way of knowing even ourselves, for that matter. It's a form of self-analysis. However, it may be surprising to hear, but it actually challenges social science orthodoxy that privileges distance and detachment and neutrality. And so, you know, the feminists were among the first to challenge this in the 1970s. Who said, look, that's a male way of knowing. That what we need to do is we have to put relationships at the center of knowing. And of course, it wasn't just the feminists, also humanists and some of the cultural Marxists and so on. Nonetheless, it still remains on the periphery of social science. That still tends to privilege this sort of distant, detached, neutral, objective way of knowing. So just as an example of how pervasive this is, just a couple of weeks ago, I was giving a talk at the University of Massachusetts. There were a number of students there who had read my book, and my book is based upon 18 years of relationships with a network of Puerto Rican men and women. And after I finished my talk, one of the students raised their hand, and I got the question that I always get. Did you get too close to write this book? right? In other words, are you biased? And it just reminded me, and this was a 19-year-old student, this is not a critique of her, right? She was speaking from a paradigm of science, just how pervasive this way of doing research is. And it's so pervasive, it makes it hard for us to ask what I think is the obvious question, which is, if you don't get close, how do you know? I mean, knowledge is rooted in relationships, and as relationships change, what we know changes as well. So what is it that we learn from applying empathy to research? What are some of the lessons from this? Why is this so important? Well, number one, it helps us to avoid reductive representations of study participants. We don't see study participants in monolithic, one-dimensional descriptions. They're a single mother, they're an absent father, they're a drug dealer. We see them more in their holistic lives. It humanizes those groups that have been demonized, number two. It helps us to avoid dominant tropes that pathologize and devalue groups, and instead allows us to critically engage, to understand, to humanize, and to holistically analyze these groups and individuals. Number three, it advances what we call the sociological imagination. That is, it allows us to see how larger social and historical structures and forces shape individuals' lives, how people or groups are located within an organization of power and domination. With socially and economically marginalized group, it allows us to discern the ways in which oppression is lived, in which it is felt. Yes, felt. Feeling is a part of research as well. And the ways in which it is resisted. It forces us, number four, it forces us to be honest about knowledge creation. So instead of asking the question, what do I know? It forces us to ask the question, how do I know? Okay? And where am I at? Number five, it also humanizes the researcher. Because researchers, particularly those who are differently located from the groups they study, what do? We put ourselves in the unfamiliar, right? In unfamiliar spaces. And as we do that, as we're there long enough, the unfamiliar becomes more familiar. And as that happens, the familiar becomes less familiar. Right? That's another way of saying it. As we put ourselves in other spaces and learn about other cultures, we also learn about our own culture. And in doing that, we do what? In doing that, it exposes privilege, it imposes humility, and it in fact humanizes ourselves. It allows us to write against the dominant currents that police our own social science disciplines. It allows us to write history from below. It raises important questions, and this is particularly important. It raises questions about for whom knowledge is created. Can it be created for liberation and emancipation, rather than be integrated into state systems that reproduce inequality and oppression? And the last point, and this is what I think is important for the conference today, to connect this empathy with the panels that will be, or the plenaries later today, is does doing this kind of research that builds on empathy and relationships make it possible to move to the next stage of consciousness raising, political engagement, social justice, and social transformation? Empathy, I believe, is a process of relating that is at the center of that work and has to be at the center of that work. I mean, do you want to learn about people who have relationships with other people, or do you want to learn about the outcomes of survey research? Right? And let me just finish with a quote that I think certainly represents this quite well from one of my co-conspirators and colleagues, David Brotherton, who works with street youth gangs. And I think he brings it together well when he says, listen, when we work to disabuse ourselves as the researcher of our own domain of assumptions and work assiduously to learn from and with study participants under similar conditions of constraints, possibility, and ambiguity. Okay? Now I want to introduce Damien. I think Zoe's going to introduce Damien, but let me just say Damien is my research partner, collaborator, co-conspirator. We are working together. We've been working together over the last year at the McDonald Community-Based Corrections Facility, where we are engaging, developing relationship with fathers in this facility, prison facility. We have been welcomed into this space by some terrific facilitators of the fatherhood program, and I want to recognize them. Mukit Sabor, who is here today, and I don't know if Farouk is here. Farouk Abdul Khalik. I don't know if Farouk is here, but I would also like to recognize Farouk as well. They have welcomed us into this space where we together are developing relationships with them, developing relationships with the men, developing relationships with one another. We continue those conversations in groups and individually. After the men are released, we continue those conversations, and it is a good way to illustrate how empathy is at the center of what we learn about others and about ourselves. So I'm going to turn it over to Damien. Thank you.
I'm a visual person, so when I hear things, I try to visualize it. So when I hear empathy, I immediately look for an associated vision, something that I can connect to it more. And the first thing I thought of was me, empathy. Why do I say that? Because me being here is the gift of empathy. When I reflect back over my 19 years of incarceration from the age of 18 to 36, and I think about 18 years old fighting and bleeding in the prisons, I think about solitary confinement. I think about the violence and the brutality, and I think about the violence on myself by being related to my number, not my name, 270201. And so Tim reminded me of something. You heard the saying, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but let's take it further. The sense of feeling beautiful is in the mind of the beheld. So before I can be empathetic to my brother, to my sister, to their situation, I had to learn what it was to be empathetic to myself, for my own transgressions, for my own sins. I had to, for instance, look with empathy on the 18-year-old me who took life. And I always say his name is Timothy Massey. And for me to even arrive at that place of forgiveness, at that place where I was finally ready to bow before my Most High and say sorry and mean it and feel it and breathe it and bleed this, I had to first look holistic at the 18-year-old me and how that 18-year-old me was shaped, how I arrived at that point. We have a habit of looking at where we fail as opposed to where we slipped. Where were the slips that led me into that decision making? And this is what Tim is talking about with the empathy. We're looking at a soul holistically. We're looking at the environment that shaped, that impacted, that molded, that in many cases weaponized that soul. And before I could do this, I first had to see myself in this formation. I first had to see myself in this molding. And this is why, this is so important and such a blessing. And I feel so humble to have even been selected by Tim to be a part of this project because of the relationship building. We hear words objectivity, neutrality that Tim talked about. That professional distance so you don't get swept up into the madness and the sadness of the subject that you are observing. How unhuman that is. And I could say that quantitatively because I know what it's like to be studied. I know what it's like when I was incarcerated and they would bring administrators and people from the community to walk the prisons and tout their programs and how we're helping to transform the inmates, but never say a name. So this work is very important. And so when Tim is talking about the holistic observation and participation in understanding these souls that we are dealing with. Is talking about looking at the very environment that shaped them. And there's a saying that only those of us who've been bitten by the snake can tell each other how it feels. So yeah, when I'm sitting there and I'm listening, I'm also feeling every pore is open. Because even when I'm dealing with my tough brothers, and we gotta go through, excuse my French, our pissing contest and our beating on our chest and who we know to establish our credibility, I do this through the lens of empathy and through the filter of empathy, because I know at the other side of this ritual is a somewhat nervous man, a soul who's trying to find his place in space and time and trying to find his space in the community. And actually is looking to be recognized and validated on some level. But in the penitentiary, we learn you validate me through my ability to administer pain and violence, because you will respect me one way or another. That's a fear-based thing. But when you, through empathy, peel all of that back, you see a human being. You see a soul suffering. You see a soul reaching out from there, trying to find meaning and understanding, but only has the tools to use in which that soul was shaped in. This is why this work is so important. Y'all all know the saying that you can judge a country by how it treats its elderly and its prisoners. This mass incarceration piece is big because we all know this. I'm preaching to the choir. We got the biggest prison population on the planet. The biggest. So when we're looking at our communities, when we're looking at our neighborhoods, if we're looking at our nation, this is the barometer. This is where the work begins. This is where the recruitment for the soldiers, our empathetic soldiers, to help change this global deficit of empathy. This is where we recruit from. This is why this work is so important. Again, I shared with you, I'm a visual person. I remember when I was came to Grafton Correctional Institution to speak about a program that I wanted to work inside the prison and facilitate. And so they let me come in and speak amongst all the administrators and the important folks in the suits and the ties. You know I got one or two, but the suits and the ties that came to assemble there. And I kept hearing these words, these evidence, these data-driven models and these evidence-based best practices. And I'm thinking, okay, now what am I going to get up and say about that? How am I going to, speak my piece and what I'm trying to do? And again, me being the visual person, I just got up and I said, I'm hearing all this talk on these terms I just mentioned. And I said, well, people, I'm your data. You talking about the power of your programs. I used your programs. You helped sire me. Even though your programs was lacking a certain fundamental authenticity to it, you still provided me a space where I can grow and evolve and bring me into it. And what Tim was talking about, the exercising of this new imagination, imagining yourself. What's this higher vision of yourself? Something that, all of us who have been incarcerated, or even those of you who find yourself in an incarcerated situation, so to speak. You have to reimagine yourself out of that. That's an act of imagination. That's an act of magic. M-A-G-I-C-K. That means cause change and conformity with your will. That's an act of magic. To look at this higher vision of yourself and say, be, and to marshal the resources and the motivation out of your very being and make it happen and push it forward. In spite of the haters, in spite of the stereotypes, in spite of the ignorance. And now here we are doing this research where many of the souls that I am building relationships with and constructively engaging were my brothers when I was incarcerated, who are still searching for themselves. who have come home and ran into that big old F thing that they drop on you when you're looking for opportunity. Oh, you have a felony, sorry. In spite of the progress that's made, many of these souls are disenfranchised, and so they fall back again. And here I am sitting here. Tim and I was with a soul who I was incarcerated with, who was just in a terrible situation. You know, and I'm sitting there, and I'm have every pore open, and I'm listening to him, and I'm feeling it, because I know that snake bite, and my eyes are watered, you know, but because of the place we at, I have to suck it back, you know. I still got that thing, whatever we call it, Mel Bravo or whatever. But I was feeling this guy, and I take that home with me at night. And my wife said, you need to leave that there. Don't bring that here. And, you know, I looked at her, and, you know, when I'm a little spicy at my wife, I say, woman, you wrong. And I'm like, how can I not? How can you, her working for the Centers of Family and Children, how can you put that distance between, if you really want to be a change agent, if you're really on this journey with me of becoming a human being? We can't do it. And so this research has given myself, and I think I could speak for Tim, the opportunity to become better human beings and to be reminded of the gifts and the blessings that we have when we're dealing with the souls who's just struggling. And so this work is super important for all the 4 reasons that I said. I will say this again. We can judge a nation by how it treats its elderly and its prisoners. We're the biggest incarceration nation on this planet. This is where a lot of our work and energy and imagination and resources need to be invested in, because not only is it swallowing up our men, our women, it's swallowing up our young also. And it's creating another culture around that where it's almost a rite of passage to go to the penitentiary. We need to challenge that. Thank you.
Thank you both, Damien and Tim. That was absolutely moving. A lot of my work is based in the liberation of trans people of color. Locally, I work amongst a few organizations, and I also work nationally for the Trans People of Color Coalition. As a transgender woman living in America today, I'm realizing and witnessing and experiencing all at once the impact of the intersection of where race, class, gender, and sexuality really all kind of meet in this country. As a transgender woman, I know that as a general non-trans and GNC population, there's a really large misunderstanding around our identities, around gender, period, also around sexuality, but especially around gender. And it's rooted into our categorical social conditioning of humans of categorizing and ranking and dividing individuals. It's a human condition to understand groups within one another, understand that there are people that look different than us, there are people that identify different than us. We have also socialized a condition to which we can rank, or we feel entitled to rank, divide, and categorize people. In 2013, I saw, unfortunately in Cleveland, a murder of CC Dove, which was something that hit me not only deeply being a transgender woman, but just being a human, and realizing that the the culmination of person's otherness, for Samia Dove, CC Dove, being a black transgender woman in Cleveland, realizing exactly not only how the city viewed her, but how the community viewed her. And because of those views, her life was viewed as disposable. For anyone not familiar with the case, she was 23 years old. She was brutally murdered. She was stabbed over 40 times, tied to a concrete pole, and dumped in a pond in North Olmsted. The first response that came out of Cleveland was, if anything, an extreme example of the lack of empathy. The first headline that came out of Cleveland highlighting her murder was, "Oddly dressed man found dead in pond." Not only is it an example just of the ignorance of what we understand about gender and identity, but just the understanding of fellow humans. So the work I do is largely rooted with that headline always running through my mind, because every day that I am working with people in my community and people outside of my community, I see where that culmination of ignorance that leads to fear, that leads to either violence or understanding, but always goes to violence, comes into play. So before, we're going to do a little Q&A. I think I do the Q&A with y'all first, and then we open it up to the audience. Is that right?
You're in charge.
Excellent. Oh, come on now. I can't assume that much privilege. It does bad for me. All right, so we're going to open it up, a couple of questions for you, and then we're going to open it up for the questions for the audience. We have microphones on either side. If you are able to walk to them, please do and begin to. If not, put a hand up or make some form of notice, and we'll do our best to get a microphone to you. So the first question for our panelists, or for our presenters, sorry. How can we change the language and systems of business to steward empathy?
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. How can we change the language and system of business to steward empathy? I need to explain that.
Take-
You got it. I'll take it. Okay. Hello? Can you hear this? So this is a big part of the work that my colleagues and I do, and it's really rooted in changing business from being for only money over short time frames into serving human beings and human needs, which can include being profitable, must include being profitable. But you can do that if you rewire things so that three things happen. Number one, that businesses work for some meaning beyond shareholder value. It can't just be about money, or else it's just going to be about money. It doesn't stir our souls. So, number one, meaning. Number two is to change the language so that it focuses more on growth, and I mean individual growth, rather than competing and all the fear-based incentives that are in organizations today. So number one, meaning. Number two, growth. The third one is to serve this human need to be whole. And that includes all of your identity. It includes being a caregiver to a parent or a child or in the community. It includes taking care of your own self, but to be able to be whole and include your whole self. So rewiring all that is some of the work that we do. And, there's kind of underneath those three things about 150 things that organizations have to do very differently. And I won't go into all the detail, but would love to share it with anyone who's interested.
Just very quickly, is this on? Okay, just very quickly, two quick answers to that. I mean, first of all, I don't think that, the problem is we have an economy that's organized around profit and not around human need. So the first thing we have to do is we have to reorganize our economy around human need. And secondly, we have to have democracy in the workplace. If we don't have those two things, I don't know how we change the language, frankly.
And I'll just sum it up with saying that consciousness follows language. And so it's really about creating a new narrative, starting with yourself and your movement. For all of us who are disenfranchised, or for all of us who are struggling to have our own identity as opposed to what's being imposed upon us. The first step in doing that is creating your own narrative. You know, who was it? Audre Lorde that said, if you don't define yourself for yourself, you find yourself chewed up and spit out into other people's perceptions of you. So goes it for the individual, so goes it for the business. And lastly, you know, when we look at politics, we see the narrative that's created by the political parties that creates a certain experience. And so we need to siege the narratives, beginning with ourselves, beginning with our business, that come up with a more holistic narrative that speak about our values, as was just mentioned, beyond profits and stuff like that.
And by the way, the narrative's not working for profit either, right? I mean, the economy's not growing the way that we need it to grow. We're not innovating. Employees are not engaged. So this narrative isn't even working for business.
Thank you. Thank you both. Well, actually, all three. Thank you. Sorry. I need coffee. All right. We have a number of audience questions here, actually. So let us begin. And I don't know how you would like to, who would like to go first?
This is for Tim and Damien. The question is the issue around consensus in terms of the context of we're talking about community organizing and interface. This issue of introspection and immersion and growth. How do we get beyond that? It's been my experience that there's a level of condescension, paternalism, issues around pity that are barriers to what you're talking about in terms of disambiguation, in terms of internalized biases and conditioning that have impeded this process. I'll just reiterate, I'm talking about internalized biases, conditioning, clinical projection. I'm talking about introspection, the existential sublimination of that in the process of interfacing with these demographics that are marginalized. Oftentimes it becomes more about me than the community itself. And when we talk about community organizing, it becomes an issue of paternalism, pity, and condescension, and that we're operating on our internalized biases and conditioning. So relevant to what your processes are, how do we mitigate those type of things in terms of the community organizing or working in populations who are incarcerated? Because there's also these archetypes and stereotypes that are coming forth.
Well, you use a lot of words with a lot of syllables, so I'm gonna try to distill that. From what I gathered, what you're speaking about is, one, the internalization of the stereotypes and the things, especially people who are, you know, like incarcerated folks, the internalization of their situation, you know, where you they call you an animal, you become the animal. I'm assuming that's the type of internalization that you're talking about. Well, I'll just say that through the research work we've been doing, part of what we do is create a space, a reflective space for critical self-analysis and reflection, which is the first step in not only reclaiming or forming your own identity, but harvesting those lessons along the way. And so in the creation of this reflective space for, you know, the guys to ask those questions, you know, how did I fall here? And to autopsy those slips, so to speak, and to see the lessons in that and apply those lessons in their growing sense of identity. That's the first step, you know, and if you're talking about in a sense of organizing, then the first thing is dealing with the smaller pieces, which is the self, which are the individual souls that you bring to the organizing. So if they come with a rooted identity and a strong sense of who they are, what their purpose is, and they gather into a nurturing space with others of similar purpose and focus, then we can make some things happen. Then we can create a new narrative and overturn the stereotypes that I think you were mentioning about and things like that in a nutshell.
I know it wasn't for me, but it's making me think about the difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy meaning I'm going to reach down here and pull you up, because you're way down there.
Yeah.
Versus empathy, which is we are vulnerable human beings together, and I'm actually no more of a winner or more invulnerable than you are to all the things that are going to happen, including that we're all going to die. And so it makes me think about that mix-up. I think paternalism is a mix-up of sympathy and empathy.
Thank you. I'm retired military, and I'd like to say that one of the things when people asked me last week, what did I fight for in the military? I fought for freedom of speech and freedom of religion because I'm not a Christian. But I want to say that, like what you said, cash is king, military-industrial system. When you go back, I was in the service from 1973 to 1991. And people ask me what war was I in. I was in the Cold War. If you remember, Reagan told Gorbachev to tear that wall down. There was not a bullet shot, but the wall came down. A whole lot of people came over here from the Soviet Union. Now, that was also considered psychological warfare. When I got out of the military, I noticed that a lot of things that used to be only done in the military was now incorporated in the civilian populace. I refused to go to work. I went to school. I went down there to Cleveland State and got my degree in international relations. Now, psychological warfare is visual. Like you said, Damien. Psychological warfare is in our music, is in our television, what movies you watch, what other stuff you watch on the TV. That's psychological warfare.
Yep.
The images that are thrown in our head.
Yep.
Now, who gets rich off of these wars on terror? Yep. Or all these other wars that are going on? Who is getting rich on these wars that is keeping the people divided? And that's my question that I want to ask you. Because we've been in war since the late 1980s. You can look, 1800s. And you can look on the Google and see how many wars the United States have been in. It's over 30. And check it out. Psychological warfare. And that's what we're up against strategically and technically. And once you decide and discern what you're going to watch on TV, what you're going to look at on the news, what you're going to listen to in the music, and start thinking what you grew up thinking that you believed, and not know, but you believed in Santa Claus, but you grew up. So what you know is not what you believe, and it's what you think. It's who am I? And like you said, we all, when we put our minds together, we can change some stuff just in the thinking.
You are hitting on something huge. Thank you for that comment. This is huge. Fear is very profitable, and it's profitable for a lot of people. And there's a wonderful book out right now. It's called The Science of Fear, and it goes industry by industry of how fear is levered as psychological warfare to make us buy drugs, buy consumable goods, buy protection services, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Fear is very profitable. And it is up to us if we can take ourselves out of that narrative by being careful about what we take in. It changes the way our neuroscience, our amygdala, responds to this fear. And it's really important because otherwise we're trapped by it.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. This was an excellent presentation. My question is for Tim and Damien. It's related to, I think you said you went into McDonald's prison and you meet with the inmates. I have a twofold question. One, can you tell us a little bit more about that when you go in and what is happening when you're actually there? And the second part of my question is, what do you do to, if anything, to advocate for changes within the prison system related to food, the conditions, and what is actually going on in the prisons?
Go with the first part.
So we are in a community-based corrections facility, which is sort of an alternative facility to prison in the sense that it's run by a human service organization. It's for, in this case, men who have sentences that are 6 months or less. They don't use the traditional language that's used in prisons. There are no inmates, there's no warden, and so on. Referred to as residents, they're referred to as, the warden is what we would call a director. It's still a lockup facility. It's still a facility in which the residents have very limited freedoms and so on, but they do have more freedoms than are typical, as Damien can talk about, in a county jail or in prisons. What we do is we have, as I said before, we were invited in welcomed in, I should say, by the facilitators of a fatherhood class. And so our interest is to engage fathers around issues of manhood and fatherhood, and to start a conversation around that. As Damien said, I think what and I won't speak for him, but I think what we are trying to do is it creates this reflective space. I mean, it's really quite interesting. I never really thought about prisons in this way, but when you go into a prison, it changes who you are. There's a whole different set of hierarchies and ways in which you have to negotiate your day-to-day life. You become someone else, and in this prison, these programs and the fatherhood programs does provide a reflective space. So men are thinking about their past, their children, their relationships, their jobs, their biographies, and they're trying to reconstruct those narratives in a way that may serve them better in the present and to project a different narrative into the future. Fortunately, of course, this is a particularly reflective space that does not resemble the world outside that space. And so what we're learning is when we move outside that space, these men become something else because now they're in a different set of hierarchies and structures and roles and so on. And of course, for many of these men, as Damien alluded to earlier, a lot of these very hopeful plans and intentions and so on are very, very difficult to sustain when they go out there because they're sleeping on couches. They're essentially homeless. They don't have jobs. They can't get jobs. Children may not want to speak to them. There's maybe some assorted history with partners and so on. And so it's very difficult in some ways to watch men develop a sense of masculinity in one space and become extremely emasculated in another space.
And part of the mix that's brought in as when I'm helping with them is that I give them a tool on how to engage in the programs in there. So for example, how to build their living resumes through their program engagement and how to create a narrative around that engagement that not only empowers them while they're doing their time, but also as a way to market themselves post-release. And I use myself as a template. And some of my unsung peers who are very successful out here, who operate different nonprofits and are part of successful businesses who are not lifted up, use them as models and templates for how they did their time. So for instance, what does that look like when I say that? Sometimes I'm asked, how did you do 19 years? I say I did it professionally. And I talk about literally 11 years of immersement in programs that when they ran out, I began to write programs and facilitate them after developing and cultivating enough goodwill dividends with the administrators there. And through my facilitation of these programs, it gave me a wealth of content for my living resumes and how to market myself. I'm no different from them. I'm not smarter than them. We often talk about this, and the only difference between myself and them is degrees of application. So while many of the souls inside are busying themselves with the distractions of doing time, some of us are in the books, some of us are immersed in that internal journey. And so what I do is I give them tools on how to do that. And when they're in the infancy of reconstructing or salvaging their identity, that's when, like for me, being able to relate and to recognize where they're at in that journey, I can give them tools, proven tools, and I can just be there to be that confidant as one who is familiar, who's been in that, and help them negotiate that. And so we've had a lot of success in that. And it has helped to establish credibility in there, and more importantly, the relationship building. We have relationships with these souls, which is most important. And I'll end this by saying, when I say relationship, I don't mean superficial. I don't mean that when one of these men see me at the gas station and we just, and they like, let me holler at you, I'm like, all right, I'm gonna get at you. No, I mean a relationship that when I get a call at home and I got a guy saying, look, I got a job interview, I need a bus pass. I don't need nothing from you, but can you give me a week bus pass for a week? And I'm like, man, I'll just bring you the money, man, handle it. That's the type of relationships I'm talking about, and that's the reward.
Can I just ask, Mukit, is there anything you want to add to this? You're in the same space? All right.
Thank you for that question.
Hello, my name is Kim Foreman. I run a nonprofit, Environmental Health Watch. And the current time, equity is getting funded now. So we have a lot of institutions and hospitals and bigger nonprofits going after the dollars. And you could kind of see a disconnect between equity and implementing equity. But as we're having this conversation, it seems like truth-telling is the basis of understanding empathy in order to be able to implement equity. So with the disconnect, I have a question between Tim and Damien, your relationship. How did you start to develop this relationship around truth, understanding, and what were some of the struggles? Because Tim, you seem to come with a lot of understanding, but I just want to hear more about how did you even get to the point you're at now between each other, and Damien, looking at Damien as an equal in your research. And then another question is, how do you work this in with your associates or your other professional colleagues, because they definitely, some folks don't really understand this space.
Well, first, let me say this. I got to give a shout out to Case, because I was here, I believe, 2 years ago speaking at a social justice forum, and Tim was one of the gentlemen afterwards who asked to do a one-to-one with me. And through that series of one-to-ones, he asked for the backstory. And as anybody who knows me, if you give me a powerful cup of coffee, I become very loquacious. But like a flower in sunlight blooming, somebody was asking the backstory and was very interested, and I opened up, and through that he says, hey, I'm starting this research project and you're gonna have to sort of go back to school for it, but I'd like for you to be a part of that. I'll let Tim tell the rest, but you can imagine how affirming it is to come from that type of history and to have somebody interested in that part of your history and validate it, to say, hey, you messed up, but look at the strides you made through that. Look at the art of how you negotiated that. That's valuable, and to allow me to, through his lens, to see it that way. Very affirming, and it helped me evolve.
The way that we approach one another, Damien and I, and that we approach the fathers and the men that we're developing relationships with, is we begin with the premise. This really gets back to the first question that was asked, actually, about paternalism and power in relationships, and the researcher having the power in a relationship with study participants and so on. It's a way we try to address that. The first thing you got to do is you got to acknowledge it, right? All that's true. Right? We do have more power, we are differently located, and so on. So the first thing to do is to acknowledge it. But the second thing, our premise is that everybody has knowledge, and that knowledge is based on their experience. The problem, right, is that a lot of people are walking around and they have this wealth of knowledge and they don't know it because they've never been validated. We don't recognize just how important that knowledge is and how it can actually advance social justice, particularly marginalized groups. People who have experienced oppression can teach us about oppression, right? And the thing is that when I met Damien, I was interested in what Damien's experience had been and what he knew and what he could teach me. because he had lived a different life than I had lived, and I think he feels the same way. We come from different places, different spaces, and we're trying to make sense out of one another, and we begin with that premise, and we take that into the prison with us. We want to be able to validate men's knowledge, and I think Mukit helps us to do that as well. That's one of the ways in which he approaches the men as well. You know, the problem is that in the society we live in, we tell some people that their knowledge is more important than other people's knowledge. We validate some people's knowledge than other people's knowledge, and when you do that, people get to walk around and really feel good about themselves. They get up in the morning and they exercise because they feel great because they have been validated. What we're trying to do is say, no, that's fine, but the knowledge that marginalized people have is also very important, and we need to validate that and bring that into our research practices.
I want to add one short thing to that, which is I think the other mix-up we have in paternalism is that winning is somehow a human need, and the human need really is for meaning. Viktor Frankl said this best 60 years ago, right? That we make meaning out of struggle. So you are wealthy in meaning, right? And anybody who's struggling has a wealth to share.
Thank you. Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm presently a parent volunteer at the Cleveland School of the Arts, and I have a Girl Talk and Boys to Men session during lunchtime for the children there. And Jackie, when I seen the picture of your children, it just warmed my heart. I remember the word empathy coming from my father at a very, very young age. And as a mother of 5 and a grandmother of 5, my youngest being 4 years old grandchild, and my oldest being 22 years old grandchild, my oldest child being 43, and my youngest child being 18. I've been working hard in my capacity as a mother of many to instill that word empathy in my children and other children as a parent volunteer. But my question to you, Jackie, and of course Damien and Timothy, if you have anything to add, I would greatly appreciate it. How do we, as parents, as parenting figures to children, instill the true meaning of what the word empathy really is supposed to mean? I also feel that compassion has a great part in implementing the word and the true meaning of empathy. And for us as a nation, and being so affected by the penal system, that I'm working hard to keep my 2 grandsons, 11 and 22. And truly, my son did serve in Iraq. He is a vet, and he's 34. But for the males, Timothy, Damon, in my community, it's so hard for them truly to feel the true meaning of empathy because of our society in this country won't allow. Thank you.
Well, it's a big question. I'm going to need your help, guys. And we could spend an entire conference just on empathy in children, and maybe sometime somebody will. My answer to that, my first answer to that is that we show it to them. And we show it to them from the time that they're little babies. And that is why I talked about time and working parents and time. Because it does take time to build that bond. You know this better than anybody with all the children and grandchildren, that those little bitty babies can feel whether or not you are interpreting their needs before they're even verbal. And this is the beginning. That's why Simon Baron-Cohen in the book does deal with parenting and with children and the neuroscience of empathy, that just holding those babies and giving them what they need helps build their circuits, their capacity in their brains for empathy. And being able to empathize with your children as they grow not fuse with them and become a helicopter parent or be a patriarchal parent, but be the kind of parent that provides the right kind of discipline, meaning kind of giving them guidelines, helping them grow in a way that acknowledges who they are, their identity, the light inside of them. And if you're lucky enough to have a parent who does that, you know how that feels, and you have plenty of reserves to give away to other people. And you also have plenty of reserves to stop the affront that you get in society if your identity is not fitting a certain situation. I was lucky too. I had a father and a mother, but especially my dad. Still, God bless him, still alive. Very empathic human being. Doesn't mean you have to be nice. My dad, I worked for him when I was a kid. He owned a grocery store. I worked for him most of my young life. He fired me when I was 10 for insubordination, right? Because I needed that lesson, right? So, I mean, he wasn't always nice, but he saw deep inside of me and still does. And when you have somebody who does that for you, and if it's not a parent, then maybe it's Damien and Tim coming into the prison in that moment, right? When you have people who see inside your soul, you know then what that feels like, and you have something to give to other people.
I'll share a personal response to that. I used to be very mad at my mother. When I was 12 years old, my mother was incarcerated. That's how I ended up in the system. Children's home, foster homes, some of them abusive. I ran away. By the time my mom came home, I was 16, 2 children, been incarcerated 2 times as a juvenile, beard and mustache, hang out at the bars, sell dope, carry a gun. She couldn't reach me. I was mad at my mom because she used to take me to the doctors to play hyperactive so she can get 20 milligram Ritalins to bang her veins, sell on the side, all that stuff. Fast forward, in the penitentiary, when I was in that transitional period where I was hanging question marks on everything. Why am I here? Why do I think like this? What's my purpose? Things like that. I was watching a nature show, and it showed a very hungry, almost starving lioness hunting the elk in the Serengeti during a drought. And I'm watching the narrator be very tender toward the plight of this lioness, even after she took down the elk and backed away from me, using the last of her energy, backed away from me to allow her cubs to eat before she took her own nourishment. In that moment, I had, as Oprah Winfrey said, an aha moment. And I loved my mother dearly because I had realized that my mother had a backstory, and I never asked. I never heard her talk about her mother, her parents, her father, no, nothing. And I never knew her backstory. And I realized that I had, during that time, come to really start to love myself and value myself. And that was only made possible because through all my mother's tragedies, her drug addictions, and later what I discovered, her sexual abuse is why she ran away from home, while she was put into a life of prostitution because the uncle and the father that molested her would give her nickels and dimes. So when this guy got in her head, she was already primed for that. So I understood why she was broken. That's when I felt the first flush of empathy. And I felt love because the fact that I can love even now came because my first frame of reference of love was from my mother. Even through her addiction, even through her diseases, even through her own broken spirit and body, she was able to pull love out of that and give it to me. And that saved me from becoming that savage when I was in the penitentiary. So now when I look at my son, even my grown children, but particularly my youngest son who gets what my other children couldn't get because I'm present now. And he pisses me off because he does things I tell him not to, like mess with outlets. I still feel an empathy and a love for this little soul because he's trying to figure himself out. And I learned a valuable lesson in observing one of McQueen's classes when he said that when a baby is born, if that baby is not touched, does not receive no human contact, I believe within the first couple of weeks of life, it will die. If a child who is born does not receive any type of human contact within the first couple of weeks of its life, it will die. We are wired for it. And even though my mom was what she was, she still loved me according to her nature. And in spite of the things that happened to her, she showed me love, and that's why I'm here today.
I was going to just add one anecdote too, if I could. I know there's, how much time do we have? So
The current time, it is 11, we're actually overtime, but
oh, okay.
we can,
Well,
I mean, like, I have no problem with keeping going.
let's have a question.
Hi, I'm Auburn Sandstrom. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Akron, and my background is mainly education. And back in the late 80s, I aligned myself with a former Black Power movement activist, and this was in the late 80s, in the height of the crack epidemic, and my badass landed in jail and shaking fists at police and so forth, and judges, and calling myself, throwing myself in with the plight of the people. And in that journey, because I do come from a place of privilege, I was able to go ahead and pursue multiple graduate degrees and so forth. And when I got back into the school system, I came at it backward. I was like, wait a minute, they're running this place like a correctional facility. And I took some drama troops. I took some urban drama troops up into the elementary schools, and they were already treating those children like inmates. And as I furthered my study, I got to take a look at the disproportional representation of African American young men and children in suspensions, discipline, et cetera, as well as saw with my own eyes the inability, typically, of white educators to actually see the humanity of those young children of color. I'm grieving, and I'm angry, and I'm traumatized every damn day. And I'm looking for the world where gentlemen like Mr. Calvert, in my work, in my interaction with former prisoners, there's an entire community of men and women who are conscientious intelligentsia, who have every means, thought, soul, emotional intelligence to be thought leadership in this country and in this world. Reentry programs, the social programs, even social justice, little bitty schools inside of schools were like tiny picket sign. When it's crumbs. Okay, I'm preaching now. I want to make this statement, and respond or not. It seems to me that we have a thought trust of immense power in these men and women that are coming out of long-term incarceration. And I have met many who have done 15, 20, 25 years in penitentiaries innocent.
My name is Mississippi Charles Bevel, and the question that I have probably should be saved until the social transformation section, but I'm so old I might be dead by this afternoon. But the question is about, there are two notes in my writings here. One of them is about rewriting language, and the other has to deal with Tim's kind of chicken and egg thing about what should come first, the change in the economy or the change in language. 70 years ago, as a 7-year-old child, I went with my family and millions of other people to pick cotton for 10 hours a day because that was our job. We got our dollar, we went home and did with it whatever we could do to keep ourselves alive. Shortly, machines and chemicals replaced us and the mules. Some of us made it to Cleveland, where my older brothers got jobs in the steel mills. With the advent of hydraulics, pneumatics, steel, rubber, and computerized automation, those jobs are gone, as well as the one in the car industry. And the question is this. And so that left the 400,000 of us sitting around in Cleveland competing to flip hamburgers at McDonald's. The question is, how can we, or how do we go about formulating the language to get people to stop thinking about jobs and thinking about a life? In this sense, I can't imagine Dr. Mobley or Dr. Rhonda or any of you in academia hoping and praying that you get to 65 so you can retire. You have a life, and you're going to be doing that life till they run you out of here. The question is, how do we get the rest of society to think about what we want to do as a life rather than a job?
I have three answers to that. We organize, and we organize. I simply don't know how else to do it, Mississippi Charles. I mean, everywhere I look in the work that Damien and I are doing, I see the vacuum of the left. I mean, the reason that these men step out into a world that has that basically is either indifferent or hostile to them, because we have a vacuum of the left. I don't know how else to do it. You know, I watch Mukit inside the programs. He certainly has an understanding of structural oppression, but what is he going to tell these guys? He's got to tell them something that can help them in the immediacy of their lives. They need homes, they need jobs, they need resources. They need, so he can't even go there. He can't even get to the place of talking about structural oppression because we don't have a context, a political context that will enable him to do that. So everywhere I look, I see the vacuum of the left. And so the only answer I can give you is that, it's not that, we have a precarious workforce, but we have a state that's created a precarious workforce. And so our work has to be to reform that state. And we can't do that without organizing.
Good morning. My name is Pierre Napier. I am the co-founder of the New Black Democratic Party of Cuyahoga County, 137 bullets strong. Before I go into a few comments that I want to make, I want to go back to last night over at Covenant Church. I want to commend the Social Justice Department here at Case Western Reserve University. The highlight of last night for Pierre Napier was when those three next generation, and next generation had an opportunity to express themselves. I was in line last night to make a comment, but I refused to go before those three young people because it's necessary for us, and the room should have been full of young people. That is, we are preparing for them. I have lived most of my life, and I want to give something back. The reason that I formed the Black Democratic Party of Cuyahoga County, 137 bullets strong. It was born out of the massacre of Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams by a neo-Nazi police department, a civilian police department in the city of Cleveland, Ohio. When 9/11 occurred, all of America was up in arms. But when that massacre occurred here in the city of Cleveland, with all of these institutions, churches and otherwise, there was not a sound of compassion or empathy. I say to those that thought 9/11 was a horrible thing for America, I'm going to talk about the evils of white democracy and white supremacy. And if we don't address white supremacy, what's going on in France will visit America. It has already visited America. The ISIS movement, the behavior, the consent decree speaks to it. Torture, killing of unarmed citizens by the citizens of civilian police departments, not only here in Cleveland, but across this nation. America is at war with itself and don't know it. America has been at war with the black community for over 200 years. I'm going to close at that. I just wanted to give you some food for thought. But let me talk about Tamir Rice a little bit, ladies and gentlemen. When you start killing innocent kids, that's why I stopped last night and moved back away. Tamir should have been there last night. He couldn't be there, so I'm going to talk for him. That commission that they have formed does not speak to the realities of what's going on. Timothy McGinty, Stephen Delavac, the Attorney General, neo-Nazi judge John P. O'Donnell, the mayor's office. In 1967, Carl Stokes, the first and only black mayor of the city of Cleveland, out in the Glenville area, had to pull out the police, the white police officers, because it would have been a bloodbath. They got on those taxpayers' radios and called him all kind of niggers. Ladies and gentlemen, you are close to the neo-Nazi movement, closer than what you think. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Faye Tucker, and I appreciate y'all doing this seminar on empathy, because I wish we would have had this when I was growing up 50 years ago. Because if they had this in school and taught it to our children, there would be less crime and less crime on each other. And I'm thankful for the fatherhood program, because I wish we would have had this years ago. What I wanted to ask, and the reason I came up here, is because the fatherhood program is a wonderful thing. But society and in Ohio, they make it think it's, oh, I just want your child support. I want to get a father to come in here and say how bad a father he is. They don't go into the deepness of that the fatherhood help fathers that's been in prison. Get a job, get his license, get education. I've been lucky enough to go through the tort employment program that helped fathers that didn't teach empathy as a child. They had to go out there and rob and steal because they thought they needed to get some food or whatever and lived a life of crime. But in society, the fatherhood program is misunderstood. And I was wondering, what can we do as a community and a society to show the positive, not just say fatherhood is here to help a father with his child support. Show the goodness. I'm helping men that's got out of prison or been lost in this society get a job, keep a job, because just because you have a felony don't mean you can't live. But that's what they teach us. We can't live. What can we do to make the positive of the Fatherhood Initiative program be heard? And if we can one day start a motherhood, because there's a lot of women that are lost because we have to be a mother and father to a broken society.
If I could ask permission from the panel for something. So this is a very stimulating panel. As I'm sitting here, a lot of thoughts going through my mind. I put this on Facebook. So when I fire, if I ever shoot at someone, if I shoot a bullet at someone, I want it to fire neurons, not lead. So can I ask permission to fire on the panel? And will you fire back at me? Okay.
Well, consent is important.
Cool. So what Brother Black said was very interesting in the sense that you validate someone simply based on their experience. You say that the fact that they live is enough for their existence, is enough for our empathy. So I summarize that simply as saying our mementos are our credentials, right? Simple as that. Our mementos are our credentials. So both of you really resonated with me and brought a few mementos out, got those neurons firing. I'm thinking of my father, right? I grew up with the pathological fear, hatred, and almost confusion about him. He was incarcerated when I was a young kid, and I never really got to know him. You know, I probably have about 10 to 15 real memories of times with him. And one of those times that you brought out was when I went to go see him in a halfway house. It was Freedom House on 117th and Lorraine, I think. I don't know if it's open anymore, but it's there. And, you know, he's in a room that's maybe as big, you know, maybe from here to here, cramped in, you know, just got out of the cell. Here's your freedom, and you're in something barely even bigger with just as little resources. And when you trigger that, that's when I really start to begin forgiving him. That's when I want to go see him. That's when I want to go understand. This is a man without legs who's been addicted to drugs his whole life. But we have to be able to understand that person and love them. So what I've really tried to come at, what I'm trying to understand as a human being, is really being able to see in a moment, right? Because when you talk about that validity, it's taking every person's moment and giving them that credibility, just face value, right? So my question is, how do we begin to build monuments to moments? How do we cherish that every moment, give it validity, and build it into ourselves so that when I think back and when I'm mad at my father or my sister who's now incarcerated, I can love them and I can give them an open arm. That's my
in the moment. That's it.
Real quick, it's one word. As an observer, the answer to your question is mindfulness training. To learn to live in not only the moment, but your moment. To understand what you can learn from just being still. To understand how Native and indigenous people learned how to find their way without media. For you to understand your relationship to the world and how you create it through your visions, your thoughts, your dreams, and your choices. Thank you.
Well, that was beautiful, and we three are grateful to you for that. The only one thing I would add to that, which was beautiful, is one really simple thing to do with those moments is to be curious rather than judgmental. And it goes back, thank you, it goes back to what Damien was saying about the backstory. Everybody's got a backstory, and that backstory has a long history. So it goes all the way back to what Sister Angela was saying about being historically minded. So being curious about all that is a good starting point.
Derek, you said about building a monument in the moment. If you remember a conversation you and I once had about converting ordinary moments into legends, You remember that conversation? So it's about staining every moment with the sum total of who you are. You stain it, that's your monument. Manifest your truth in every moment. The truth of who you are, what you've been through, what you overcame, what you know. Stain it with every moment. That'll be your monument.
Thank you all for your wonderful attendance and participation in this afternoon's discussion. When it comes to empathy, think about chemistry. You have understanding, you have connection, which leads to either growth or despair. Empathy is going to be that bridge. You have to understand to connect, and you have to connect to understand. And if you're crossing that dilemma with empathy, you'll be able to connect with people in not only the moment that they are there with you, but in the moment that brought them there to you. And we are a chemical planet, and we are connected through those bonds. So we have to recognize those bonds, recognize those dynamics that brought us here, and that brought us here today, and that bring us to wherever we're going.
Tim, did you want to say something? Tim, did you want to say something real quick?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think we're where we're supposed to be right now. We have looked at empathy, we've picked it up, we've looked at it, we've twisted it around, we've stretched it, and so on. Now we're ready to go to social justice and social transformation and see how those things connect, right?
So please give a hand to this plenary session, all the panelists. I want to say this real quick, that the folks you see up on the stage shows the power, I'm going to say this, shows the power of the Social Justice Institute. And why am I going to say that and not just be self-congratulatory about that? Because Jackie Acho was at the forefront, at the front end, helping us to establish some structure and to help us figure out how we were going to build and sustain. She helped us on the team to begin to do that. And Damien actually was a speaker at our last Social Justice Institute think tank 2 years ago, at which Tim was a new professor who was hired through the Social Justice Institute initiative and met Damien and said, put me in touch with him because I think we can do some work together. This is the power of the Social Justice Institute. This is the power of why we need to be institutionalized and sustained. This is the power, y'all, of why you're working with us and helping us through any donations you can provide and helping us to show that we need to sustain this work here is extremely important. With that, I'm going to say thank you to everybody. Thank you to all of you.